the moment I stepped onto the cracked linoleum of the old Blackwell Hospital. I knew I was trespassing on something that was still breathing. Not with lungs, but with memory. It wasn't the smell of dust and decay that hit me first. It was the intense, almost liquid silence that pressed against my eardrums. The kind of silence that suggests everyone nearby is holding their breath. I had come for the photos, an urban explorer looking for the perfect shot, but I found myself listening for a sound that wasn't there. A sound that should have been there, the hum of old machinery, the creak of settling beams. But there was nothing, only the heavy, watchful quiet of a place that had died violently 20 years ago in rural New York State, and was now utterly unwilling to rest. My flashlight beam cut a path through the main hall, illuminating a nurse's station where the plastic telephone still sat, covered in a delicate, undisturbed shawl of cobwebs, as if waiting for a call that would never come. I'm Jake, a freelance photographer from Buffalo, and exploring derelict places is my hobby, my escape. Blackwell was legendary, not just for its architecture, but for the stories, rumors of a botched state-ordered closure back in the early 2000s that left behind more than just equipment. The building was a sprawl of late-century architecture, all concrete and tired brick, sitting on a neglected plot just outside the city limits. I'd seen hundreds of places like this, schools, factories, mansions, but Blackwell felt different. It felt like a museum of sorrow. The air was unnaturally cold, even for an autumn night, a cold that seeped into the marrow. In the maternity ward, I paused. A rocking chair, perfectly centered in the middle of a small, empty room, moved just slightly. A slow, gentle sway, back and forth, barely perceptible. It wasn't the wind. The windows were sealed shut by decades of grime, and the heavy weather outside was only a distant memory here, cut off by the thick walls. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds until it settled. The only sound, the faint, fast thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Settling, I told myself. Old wood, shifting. But the chair hadn't made a single sound as it moved, moving deeper into the hospital's guts. The unsettling feeling grew from a prickle of unease to a suffocating cloak. I found the old surgical wing. The floor was sticky, even under a thick layer of dust. The lights in my flashlight seemed to dim slightly as I walked through the operating theaters, each room colder than the last. I started noticing things that weren't logical, details that violated the physics of decay. In one recovery room, a single bed was meticulously made, the white sheet pulled taut, the pillow fluffed. Every other bed in the wing was stripped bare, the mattresses rotted through. Why was this one different? As I photographed it, a sharp, metallic temps briefly pierced the dusty air, like sterile bleach mixed with something coppery and dark. I swung my light beam toward the hallway and saw nothing. Then, in the beam's periphery, a fleeting movement at the far end of the hall. Near the fire exit, a ripple in the darkness, too quick to be shadow play, too fluid to be a rodent. I called out, a foolish move, and my voice was immediately swallowed by the depth of the hospital's silence. It didn't echo. It was just gone. From then on, I moved with an overwhelming sense of being observed, not just by the building itself, but by something deliberate and close. I started taking 2 steps for everyone, a quick, jerky pace that belied the mounting terror. I reached the basement access. The door was a heavy, rusted slab, and it was ajar by about an inch. I hadn't opened it. I definitely hadn't. I shone my light into the black void beyond, and the beam barely penetrated the gloom. The air flowing out was suddenly tropical, humid and thick, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet perfume that made my stomach clench. I heard a dragging sound from below, a slow, heavy shoo-shoos that suggested something large was being pulled across concrete. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The dragging stopped. A moment later, a single word, wet and low, seemed to emanate not from the basement, but from the air directly behind my ear. Stay. I ran. I didn't care about the shots, the reputation, or the stupid adrenaline rush. I bolted back through the main hall, past the nurse's station, my feet thudding loudly on the cracked linoleum. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of pursuit was absolute, a cold pressure growing on the small of my back, like an invisible hand pushing me forward, only too fast. As I reached the heavy main doors, my hand fumbling with the rusted latch, I heard a drawn-out screech erupt from the floor above, a sound that was pure, unfiltered panic, not human, but mechanical and sharp, like rusty iron being forcibly torn apart. I yanked the door open and scrambled out, falling onto the damp grass, turning back just in time to see the briefest flash of white at a third-story window, a pale shape silhouetted for a fraction of a second against the blackness inside. It was a face, long and distorted, staring directly at me, its mouth a perfect horrified "oh." I didn't stop running until I reached my truck on the main road, 5 minutes away. I drove home. The image of that face burned behind my eyelids. The next morning, I checked the photos on my camera. There were only 4. The first 3 were blurry, unusable shots of the surgical wing. The 4th was a sharp, perfect focus of the meticulously made bed in the recovery room, and on the crisp white pillow, where there had been only dust and shadow when I took the picture, was a single, fresh, dark red handprint. It was small, like a child's, and perfectly clear. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go back. I just deleted the photo, and, to this day, I can still smell that sickly sweet perfume whenever the humidity is high. The thing about the old Crestwood mining office was its location, tucked deep in the hills of northern Arizona, a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. It felt less like an abandoned building and more like the earth itself had swallowed it, then partially coughed it back up. The structure was a single-story stone block, built into the side of a defunct copper mine in the 1930s. What got me wasn't the dust or the broken glass, but the filing cabinets. Dozens of them, all standing upright in the main room, meticulously labeled, and every single drawer wide open and completely, cleanly empty. It was unnerving. Who empties a building with that kind of perverse thoroughness, yet leaves the massive, heavy furniture in place? It suggested an exit that was neither hurried nor professional, but calculated and deeply strange. I'm Maya. I document forgotten Americana for my personal archive, focusing on the relics of boom man bust cycles in the West. I'd hiked in just before sunset, intending to spend the night outside, but the office looked sturdy, and frankly, less exposed than my tent. The isolation was intense. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the only light was my headlamp, and the only sound was the omnipresent, dry wind whispering across the valley, a sound that, out here, always manages to sound like distant, low conversation. I set up my camera gear near a grimy window, the glass opaque with the grit of decades. I noticed a small detail in the corner of the room, near a rusted water cooler. The dust pattern on the concrete floor was disrupted. It wasn't a footprint. It was a faint, clean circle, about the diameter of a large bucket, and it was too fresh. I chalked it up to an animal, or maybe a previous, sloppy visitor. But the clean perimeter of the shape kept nagging at me as night deepened. The office grew impossibly colder, and the air thickened with a smell I couldn't place, not rot, but something earthy and vaguely metallic, like freshly disturbed soil mixed with ozone. I was reviewing my initial photographs when the real strangeness began. I was near the back of the building, checking out a heavy wooden door that led to what must have been the old safe or records room. I pressed my ear to the thick, varnished wood. Nothing. I took a step back, and a piece of paper fluttered down from the ceiling rafters, landing silently at my feet. It was a ledger page, yellowed and brittle, covered in neat, looping script. The text was just an inventory list, columns of names and corresponding numbers. But the unsettling part was that the ink was still wet in a few spots, slightly smudging when I touched it. How could ink be wet on a paper that had been sitting in a dead building for over 50 years? I shone my light up to the rafters, convinced a draft must have dislodged it from a hidden nest, but the rafters were clean, thick with undisturbed cobwebs and years of desiccated dust. No one had been up there. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I folded the page and put it in my pocket, deciding to leave, but as I turned back toward the main room, I saw it. One of the filing cabinets, the heavy steel beasts, was now slightly pulled out from the wall, maybe 2 inches, forming a thin, black vertical gap. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it had been flush against the wall only minutes before. I approached it slowly, headlamp cutting through the gloom. The air around the cabinet was distinctly colder than the rest of the room. I reached out, a trembling hand, and carefully pushed the cabinet back into place. As the metal met the stone wall, I heard a faint, but clear, scratching sound emanate from inside the cabinet. Not metal on metal, but something like fingernails on the thin cardboard of a file folder, rapidly drawing nearer to the edge of the drawer. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. The scratching stopped, and for a terrifying second, there was silence. Then, a slow, single tap from the other side of the metal, directly opposite my own face. I recoiled, scrambling backward, tripping over my tripod. As I fell, the sound intensified, not the scratching, but the rhythmic, rapid thudding that now pulsed from every single empty filing cabinet in the room. It sounded like something trapped and desperate, throwing itself against the thin steel walls of its prison, a chorus of heavy, desperate impacts that seemed to accelerate in their frenzy. I scrabbled backward, trying to get to the front door, the deafening noise drowning out the wind, drowning out my own thoughts. As I reached the doorway, a low guttural moan echoed from the depths of the filing room, distinct and agonizing, followed by a heavy, wet thump against the far cabinet. I didn't wait to see if any of the drawer fronts were bending outward. I burst out the front door, the night air shocking and cold on my skin. I didn't even bother to close the door behind me. I just grabbed my pack and ran blindly toward the truck, the metallic, frantic drumming of the cabinets fading behind me, replaced by the howl of the desert wind. I drove the entire night without stopping. When I was finally on the interstate, hundreds of miles away, I pulled out the ledger page. I unfolded it, my hands shaking in the pale morning light. The ink was still dry now, fully set, but on the back of the page, scrawled messily in pencil that hadn't been there when I first picked it up, was a single, looping signature, followed by the date, yesterday's date. The name was one of the miners from the inventory list on the front. I tore the paper into pieces and threw it out the window. Now, when I hear the wind on a quiet night, it's not the distant conversation I hear. It's the muffled, hopeless thudding of steel. The most disturbing thing about the old orphanage, St. Jude's, wasn't its peeling paint or the broken windows, but the sheer number of shoes, dozens of them. Tiny leather shoes, canvas sneakers, little worn-out boots, all neatly lined up in the entryway, perfectly preserved under a thick, undisturbed layer of dust, as if the children had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. It was located deep in the redwood forests of Northern California, a grand, imposing Victorian structure that time and the wilderness had begun to reclaim. The silence inside was profound, but not empty. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, like the air just before a thunderstorm. I'm Sarah, and I run a ghost hunting blog. My followers had been clamoring for St. Jude's after local legends resurfaced tales of a matron who disappeared, and children who simply vanished one night in the 1950s. I'd driven hours, parked miles down a logging road, and hiked the rest of the way, eager for evidence of the paranormal. The building itself was a maze of narrow hallways and small, identical rooms. Each room held a single, rusted iron bed frame, no mattress, just the stark metal. The air was thick with a cloying scent, like old lavender and something subtly antiseptic, a smell that clung to the back of my throat. I set up my EMF detector in the common room, hoping for a spike, but it remained stubbornly flat. I moved from room to room, documenting the decay with my camera. In what must have been the playroom, I found a pile of wooden blocks. They weren't scattered by time. They were carefully stacked into a tall, precarious tower in the center of the room. It struck me as odd, too deliberate. As I photographed it, I felt a distinct chill, not just a drop in temperature, but a sensation like cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing. No draft, no open window. The scent of lavender intensified, sharp and cloying. I continued to move through the building, a growing sense of dread tightening in my chest. The feeling of being watched intensified. I swore I could hear soft, rhythmic breathing in the next room, a shallow, steady inhale and exhale. That was definitely not my own. I tried to dismiss it, attributing it to my overactive imagination, or the creaks and groans of an old building settling. But then, as I passed a classroom, I heard a faint, high-pitched giggle. It was soft, almost subliminal, but undeniably the sound of a child. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding. I waited, straining my ears, but heard nothing more. Only the oppressive silence. I decided to enter the classroom. The room was mostly bare, but on the blackboard, scrawled in chalk that looked oddly fresh, was a series of childish drawings, stick figures holding hands, a crude house, and in the corner, a figure with unusually long, spindly limbs. It was staring directly out of the drawing, its eyes just two vacant circles. Below it, in shaky, unpracticed letters, was a single word, play. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen any chalk anywhere else in the building, and the board had been completely blank when I'd first peeked into the room from the doorway an hour ago. I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively going for the pepper spray I carried for stray animals, though I knew it would be useless here. As I reached the hallway, a small, porcelain doll, previously sitting on a high shelf in the corner of the room, slowly toppled forward and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Its head snapped off, rolling eerily toward my feet, its painted eyes seeming to stare up at me from the dusty floorboards. And then, from the end of the long, dark hallway, I heard the faint, distorted melody of a music box, playing a simple, childlike tune. It was coming from the head matron's office, a room I hadn't dared to enter yet. The melody was innocent, but the way it drifted down the silent hall was utterly terrifying, hinting at something that should not be playing in an abandoned, decaying place. It sounded like it was coming from inside the office, right behind the door. The door slowly, agonizingly, began to creak open, revealing a sliver of utter blackness. I didn't need to see what was inside. The music box continued its tune, now slightly louder, and as the door opened wider, a wave of that cloying lavender scent washed over me, so potent it made my eyes water and my throat burn. It felt like a physical presence, pressing in, heavy and suffocating. I turned and ran, not bothering to look back, the haunting melody of the music box seeming to accelerate behind me, each note a tiny, invisible hand pulling at my jacket. I burst out the front door, scattering the neat rows of children's shoes as I stumbled over them, not caring about the fall. I didn't stop until I reached my truck and didn't sleep until I was back in my own bed, hundreds of miles away. The next morning, I checked my camera. All the photos were gone, replaced by a single, blurry image of the playroom blackboard. The stick figures were still there, the house still crude, but the spindly figure in the corner was now much larger, taking up half the board, and its vacant eyes had been filled in with two perfectly circular, stark white dots, staring out. I never posted to my blog again. To this day, the faintest scent of lavender sends shivers down my spine, and I still sometimes hear that childlike music box playing its innocent, terrible tune, just at the edge of hearing. The problem wasn't the bear. It was the absolute, unnerving stillness that followed. We were deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, 3 days into a 5-day hike, when we heard the unmistakable grunt and thrashing outside our tent around 2 a.m. My friend, Marc, and I did everything right. We made noise, we rattled pots, we shouted. The animal retreated, disappearing back into the black forest wall. But then, the wilderness went silent. Not just quiet, but dead. Even the crickets, who'd been a relentless choir all night, stopped mid. That silence felt less like an absence of sound, and more like a heavy, deliberate presence, waiting just beyond the thin nylon of our tent. It was the sound of everything watching us. I'm Ethan, and I've been camping and hiking the Appalachian Trail system since I was a teenager. I know the woods, the rhythms, the noises, the dangers. Marc and I had set up camp off a little used spur trail, far from the main campsites, exactly where we liked it, isolated and beautiful. The setup was textbook, food hung high, fire safely doused, gear stowed. We'd settled back into our sleeping bags, adrenaline fading, when the real unsettling event began. It was a single, gentle tap on the back corner of the tent, right behind my head. It wasn't a raindrop, not a falling pinnacone. It sounded exactly like a knuckle on a door. I froze, my breath catching. Marc, on the other side of the tent, must have heard it too, because he let out a sharp, silent exhale. We lay there, rigid, listening so hard our ears began to ring. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, a second tap, slightly louder, closer to the front zipper. I silently fumbled for my headlamp, and Marc whispered, his voice a dry rasp, "Bear doesn't knock." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. I whispered back, "Keep quiet." The tapping continued, moving in a slow circle around the tent perimeter. Maybe every 20 seconds, methodical and deliberate. Tap, wait, tap, wait. It wasn't frantic or curious like an animal. It was patient, almost polite. When the tapping reached the front of the tent again, it stopped. The silence returned, but now it felt suffocating, focused entirely on the small nylon structure we were in. Suddenly, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard in the woods, a low, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from above us, very high up. It sounded like a heavy, rough object being slowly dragged across the bark of a tree. It paused, and then the scraping noise resumed, moving down the trunk, toward the ground near our tent. Whatever was making the noise was massive, heavy, and very slow. I reached for my knife, heart hammering against the inside of my chest. The scraping stopped right outside the tent, near the back wall, and then the smell hit us. A rank, metallic odor, like burnt hair mixed with stale blood, so strong it made my eyes water. A new sound began, a low, wet, snuffling sound, right against the tent fabric. It wasn't a bear's breath. It was too regular, too close, and the accompanying scent was wrong. It sounded like something examining the tent material, running its nose along the seam. The snuffling paused directly over my head, and I could hear a faint, wet clicking noise, like dry tongue on teeth. I risked a glance at Marc. His face was a mask of sheer terror, eyes wide and fixed on the spot just above me. The zipper, the small plastic pull tab of the tent door, began to rattle, a gentle, almost playful sound. Someone or something was testing the zipper, running a finger back and forth across the tab. Then the rattling stopped, and a voice, deep and gravelly, spoke right outside the door, incredibly close, but somehow muffled, as if the speaker had no lips. The words were a slow, distorted drawl. "We know you're in there, little meat." It was English, but guttural, like a human voice box being used for the very first time. I screamed a choked, pathetic sound and scrambled backward, pulling Marc with me. The snuffling sound returned, urgent and excited now, accompanied by a sudden, heavy pressure on the front of the tent, bending the poles inwards. We ripped open the back flap of the tent and scrambled out, headlamps cutting wild arcs through the pitch blackness. We didn't grab our packs, our keys, or our supplies. We ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, tearing through the underbrush, driven by the absolute certainty that if we stayed another second, the thing would tear its way in. We ran for an hour before collapsing onto a muddy service road, shivering violently, covered in scratches and mud. We waited for dawn, listening to every sound, every rustle, every branch snap. We never saw anything. We made it back to the truck, and days later, we contacted the Forest Service to retrieve our gear. The rangers sent us photos of the campsite. Our tent was still there, but it was flattened, the poles snapped in half, and the front zipper had been meticulously, neatly pulled down. In the center of the crushed tent, etched deep into the ground beneath the floor, was a single, enormous, three-toed print, and on the trunk of the nearest large oak, scratched vertically down the bark, were 5 distinct, deep gouges. Far too high to be a bear's claw marks. I never hike in those woods again. The silence is what gets me, the complete, chilling silence before the knock. It was the smell of chlorine in the middle of the Olympic National Forest in Washington State that first told us something was profoundly wrong. We were at least 10 miles from any road or park facility, miles from the nearest clear-running stream, deep in an ancient, moss-draped wilderness. Chlorine. It was faint, but undeniably there, sharp and artificial, cutting through the scent of pine and damp earth. My partner, Liam, and I exchanged a look of bewildered unease. We'd been excited for this trip, a week of total silence and solitude in the rainforest, but that chemical odor felt like a violation, a tiny tear in the fabric of the natural world we'd come to escape to. I'm Chloe, and I teach wilderness survival in Seattle. Liam is a marine biologist. We are not easily rattled. We had hiked to a small, isolated clearing beside a waterfall, the perfect hidden spot. We set up our 2 hammocks and settled in for the evening. The faint chlorine smell persisted, strongest whenever the humid air shifted. We kept listening, trying to locate the source, but all we heard was the drumming roar of the waterfall and, then, about an hour after sunset, the rustling. It started as a subtle sound, a quiet, continuous sound of dry leaves, far off in the trees. It was rhythmic, almost like a slow, deliberate, sweeping motion, but there was no breeze. The air was dead still. We convinced ourselves it was a deer or a raccoon foraging, but the sound never varied in speed or intensity, and it never stopped. It didn't travel like an animal. It seemed to stay in the same large patch of woods, simply repeating the slow, dry rustle, minute after minute. The sound began to move closer, though still very slowly. We dimmed our headlamps to conserve battery, the darkness now feeling heavy and watchful. Liam eventually whispered, "It's too regular for anything with legs." He was right. It was a mechanical, almost metronome-like rhythm. It sounded less like movement through the brush, and more like an object being pulled along the ground, perhaps something vast and low to the earth. I pulled out my thermal imaging monocular, sweeping the dense wall of trees where the sound originated. The screen was awash of blues and purples, cold trees, cold moss. But then, a flicker. A sudden vertical column of bright red heat, impossibly thin, flashed into existence just behind a massive cedar trunk. Held there for maybe 2 seconds, and then vanished. It wasn't the shape of an animal. It was a straight line, like a thermal photograph of a fence post, but with the heat of a furnace. I swore the faint scent of chlorine flared again, briefly overpowering the pines. I lowered the monocular, shaken. I saw heat, I whispered to Liam, something hot and perfectly vertical. The rhythmic sound had stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. Now, there was a new noise, much closer, coming from the edge of our clearing. A slow, heavy squish that suggested something massive and wet had just landed on the soft, mossy earth. And another squish, and another. The sound was moving toward us, approaching the clearing. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate, and each squish was accompanied by a wet, sucking sound, like a foot pulling free from thick mud. Except there was no mud here, only dry earth and moss dot. I raised my headlamp, shining the beam directly toward the edge of the trees, a few feet from my hammock. The light hit a patch of shadow, illuminating a large, dark shape. It was mostly obscured by the ferns, but I could make out an immense, rounded form, covered in something that reflected the light, with a pale, slick sheen like wet, stretched rubber or polished stone. It was too massive, too smooth to be a known animal. As I stared, paralyzed by a terror that seized my lungs, the wet, sucking sound stopped. The dark shape simply began to rise, slowly, pushing itself up to an impossible height. It didn't have a distinct head or limbs that I could see, but as it reached its full, towering height, a single sound came from its unseen top, a sound that cut through the waterfall's roar, a slow, sustained, bubbling gasp, like someone drowning in highly chlorinated water. Liam and I ripped the straps of our hammocks free, dropping to the forest floor. We didn't bother with the packs. We ran toward the waterfall, scrambling over slick rocks, driven solely by the image of that rising, black, wet thing. We didn't look back, but as we ran, we heard the squish-squish behind us, now moving much faster, closing the distance, punctuated by that dreadful gargling intake of breath. We didn't stop running until we reached a narrow game trail, then hiked all night, using the sound of the waterfall as cover. We were miles away by dawn. The rangers found our abandoned gear days later, everything untouched. But on the ground beneath where my hammock had been, there was a perfect circle of dark, wet earth, saturated with a strong, stinging odor of fresh chlorine. It wasn't just on the ground. It had soaked deep into the soil. I can't look at a swimming pool now without feeling that cold dread in my stomach, remembering the impossible, rising thing in the dark, and that horrifying sound of wet, synthetic breathing. The sign was faded, riddled with bullet holes, and read, "Warning, no trespassing, former government land." We ignored it. We were 20 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico, deep in the desolate, high desert and endless landscape of scrub brush, pale dust, and rock formations that looked like ancient half-buried bones. We'd come out here for the unparalleled night sky, the kind of inky blackness that makes you feel both insignificant and utterly exposed. But the moment we set up our small tent behind a cluster of dark, volcanic rocks, I felt the air grow heavy with a sensation of profound observation. It wasn't the stars watching us. It was the ground itself. I'm David, a college student obsessed with astronomy. My girlfriend Jenna was skeptical, but agreed to come for the view. Our spot was remote, the nearest light pollution, a phantom, on the distant horizon. After eating, We settled down with our telescope, and the night was breathtaking. Then, around midnight, Jenna pointed to the periphery of the light cast by our single lantern. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I hadn't. She said, "A flash, like a reflection off glass, but it was moving, very low to the ground." We dismissed it as a coyote, or perhaps a trick of the moonlight on a piece of trash. But over the next hour, we both saw it repeatedly, a brief, intense, non-natural glint, always low, always fast, and always moving in an erratic, jerky pattern at the far edge of the campsite perimeter. The atmosphere grew increasingly taut. I packed up the telescope, the beauty of the stars replaced by a creeping, cold dread. As I was zipping up the case, I heard a sound from the rocks directly behind our tent. It was a single, mechanical click. It wasn't loud, but in that vast silence, it was as sharp and clear as a hammer striking an anvil. Jenna gasped, grabbing my arm. We both stood rigid, straining to hear over the low, constant hum of the desert wind. Nothing. Then, the rhythmic heartbeat began. It was faint, a deep, heavy thump, thump, thump that seemed to originate from beneath the ground, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. It wasn't a natural sound. It was too steady, too deep, like the pulse of some colossal, buried machine. The clicking returned, multiplying. It started softly, then escalated into a rapid, continuous cascade of tiny, metallic clicks and ticks, sounding like 100 small, complex mechanisms simultaneously being wound and released. The source of the sound seemed to surround us now, radiating from the dust and the scrub brush in a perfect 360-degree circle around our tent. It was as if the ground itself was covered in thousands of miniature, highly focused cameras, all activating at once, observing our every movement. The flashes returned, 24 of them, now closer and faster, like the frantic blinking of small, hidden eyes reflecting the lantern light. The fear was primal and paralyzing. We retreated into the tent, sealing the zipper, plunging ourselves into darkness. The heartbeat vibration intensified, shaking the ground slightly, and the clicking chorus peaked, a high-pitched, frenetic symphony of metallic observation. Then, directly outside the tent wall, a new sound, a dry scraping hiss, like sandpaper on bone. It was moving slowly along the bottom edge of the tent, right where the floor meets the wall. The hissing paused, just inches from my head. I could smell something acrid and sterile, like burnt plastic and old dusted deeply inorganic stench. Suddenly, the tent fabric was touched, not pushed or prodded, but gently, meticulously traced by something that felt cold, hard, and segmented. It was moving up the side of the tent, a deliberate, feather-light pressure that left a faint trail of dust-free nylon in its wake. As it reached the peak of the tent, the heartbeat vibration stopped. The clicking died instantly. The silence returned, absolute and terrifying, but it was not empty. It was filled with the clear, high-frequency sound of a single, almost inaudible whine, like the faint feedback from a piece of highly sophisticated electronic equipment. The pressure on the tent vanished. We lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the agonizing, strange silence. When dawn finally broke, painting the desert sky in sickly shades of orange and pink, we scrambled out of the tent. There was nothing there. No tracks, no evidence of anything large, not even disturbed dirt. But as we packed our meager supplies, I saw something near the edge of the volcanic rock where the initial flash had been. Embedded in the rock, sunk maybe an inch deep, was a pattern. 3 perfectly aligned pinpricks, each one flawlessly circular and about the size of a sharpened pencil tip. They formed a straight, deliberate line. We drove out of there, leaving our tent, our stove, everything behind. We didn't speak the entire way home. I still check my skin every morning, searching for tiny, immaculate punctures. And when I'm alone, I can sometimes feel that faint, mechanical thump-thump, vibrating, not in the ground, but in the deepest parts of my own chest. They say the darkest hour is just before the dawn, but for me, the darkness peaked not just an hour before the sun, but when the clock struck 3:07 a.m., that was the moment I realized the man who lived across the street, a quiet old soul named Mr. Henderson, wasn't just gone, he had been replaced. My name is Sarah, and I'd been living in the quiet, almost aggressively boring suburbs of Albany, New York, for 10 years. My life was predictable. Work, gym, walk the dog. The neighborhood was the kind where people left their doors unlocked, and the biggest crime was a lawn gnome being moved. My house sat directly across from Mr. Henderson's. He was a retired history teacher, kept his hedges neatly trimmed, and always had a gentle, distant look in his eyes, like he was perpetually thinking about the Battle of Gettysburg. He lived alone, a widower for years, and our interaction was limited to a polite wave and a shared complaint about the rising property taxes. This baseline of normalcy was the foundation of my security. The only thing that ever broke the silence was the distant, predictable moan of the midnight freight train as it rattled through the valley. It was the sound of a regular world. The change started subtly. I noticed one Tuesday evening that the ancient, peeling white mailbox in front of his house, a fixture since I moved in, was gone, replaced overnight by a pristine, black, modern box. It was a minor detail, but it stood out like a black eye on an otherwise familiar face. Then, I saw him, or who I thought was him, out in his yard after midnight, pruning rose bushes that had never existed before. Mr. Henderson was meticulous, but he was also a creature of routine. He was always in bed by 10. The late-night gardening, the new mailbox, it was a wrong note in a perfect, monotonous symphony. The escalation began a week later. The temperature had dropped, the windows were sealed, and the neighborhood was locked down in a pre-winter stillness. I was woken up just after 2:30 a.m. by a sound that wasn't the train. It was the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps walking on the slate tiles of my front porch. I froze in bed, listening. The porch light was off. I told myself it was a raccoon, or maybe the neighborhood's stray cat, but the rhythm was all wrong. It was too slow, too heavy, too human. The steps paused right outside my bedroom window, and I heard a slow, wet, dragging sound, like a sack of damp clothes being pulled across stone. I didn't dare move. I waited until I heard the steps retreat. Then I ran to the window, pulling the edge of the curtain back an inch. The streetlights cast long, cold shadows. The street was empty, but then I saw him. Across the street, standing perfectly still in the middle of his lawn, was the man who looked like Mr. Henderson. He was wearing the same faded blue bathrobe, but his posture was rigid, straight as a plank of wood. He didn't look at me. He was staring at my house, specifically at my bedroom window, and he stood there for a full minute, utterly motionless, until the porch light suddenly violently flickered on, blinding me, and when my eyes adjusted, he was gone. The next night, it was worse. The disturbance began at 3 a.m. on the dot. I was awake, tense, staring at the digital clock face. This time, the sound came from inside my house, a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch, like a fingernail gently scraping wallpaper, coming from the wall behind my bed. It moved. It traveled slowly down the wall, around the corner, and then I heard it distinctly at my locked bedroom door. It was no longer a scratch. It was a soft, steady thump thump thump, like something tapping the door with the flat of a palm, exactly where the lock was. I covered my mouth to muffle my breathing. I lay there for 20 minutes, hearing it, until the knocking stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A single, drawn-out, heavy sigh that seemed to originate not from the other side of the door, but from the air vent right above my head. It wasn't Mr. Henderson's gentle exhale. It was a sound of profound, weary, alien frustration. The climax arrived on the third night. 3:07 a.m. The air in my bedroom was oppressively cold, though the thermostat read 70 degrees. I was sitting up, leaning against the headboard, a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, ready to call 911. My back was to the window. I told myself I wouldn't look out. I kept my gaze fixed on the door. Then, a low guttural noise started. It wasn't a growl, but a kind of deep, resonant vibrating, like a massive cello string being plucked, and it was coming from outside. It grew louder, shaking the glass in my window. Against my own will, I slowly turned my head. There was the man, the replacement, standing on my lawn, closer than ever before, right at the property line. He was facing my window, and the vibrating noise was coming from his chest. The streetlight glare hit his face, and I saw it. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. The features were close, undeniably, but they were stretched too tight. The skin too smooth, the mouth a perfect thin, lipless line that looked like a scar. His eyes, they were large, black, and perfectly blank, like two pools of oil reflecting the darkness. He lifted his hand, slowly, and pointed a long, bony finger directly at me. And he didn't point at my face or my chest. He pointed at the spot on the wall behind me where the scratching had started the night before. I screamed, but it was a pathetic, choked thing, and I dove under the covers, clutching the flashlight. I didn't move for an hour. When I finally emerged, the sun was beginning to break the horizon, painting the sky with a thin, sickly orange. I looked out the window. The lawn was pristine. The street was empty. I called the police that morning, reporting a missing person, Mr. Henderson. They came, they checked his house. Everything was neat. The lights were off. The garage was empty. The car was gone. They filed the report as a voluntary disappearance. But when I went outside later that day to check my own porch, I saw it. Carved into the slate tile, right where the footsteps had paused, was a new, faint scratch. Not a raccoon claw, it was the letter H. And across the street, in front of the house that now felt utterly alien, the brand new modern black mailbox had a single, tiny, perfectly drilled hole right through the center. I know I should move, leave the house and this cursed quiet street, but every night, I find myself sitting by the window, watching that dark, silent house, because I have a terrible, paralyzing fear. I'm not afraid of the thing that replaced him. I'm afraid that one morning, I'm going to look in the bathroom mirror and see that perfect, thin, lipless line starting to form right where my mouth should be. I've always loved the desert, especially at night. There's a purity to the darkness out here in the Nevada high plains. No light pollution, just you and the overwhelming canopy of stars. It's what drove me to buy the small, isolated ranch property 50 miles outside of Tonopah. But out here, where the nearest neighbor is a half-hour drive away, I learned something terrifying. In the dead of night, the desert doesn't just hold silence. It holds things that thrive in that silence, and they are masters of imitation. My name is Kevin, and I'm a former architect who traded skyscrapers for solitude. The ranch house was ramshackle, but the land was beautiful. Just vast stretches of scrub brush, rock, and the occasional stubborn juniper tree. My first 6 months were the definition of peace. I had a generator, a well, and the only traffic I ever heard was the buzz of the power lines running over the mesa 3 miles away. The baseline of normalcy was the routine. I'd work on renovating the house until sunset, eat dinner, and be asleep by 10:30, waking with the sun. The first instance of wrongness was so subtle it felt like a hallucination. I was standing on my porch one midnight, enjoying the frigid air, when I heard a distinct, short, high-pitched whistle. It sounded like someone calling a dog. I don't have a dog, and no one lives close enough to be calling theirs. I dismissed it as wind tricking my ears, a trick of the acoustics in the vast empty space. But the seed was planted. The desert was quiet, yes, but not empty. The strange occurrences began to escalate the following week. Always between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. the first night, I was jarred awake by the sound of my pickup truck's alarm blaring, a panicked, urgent sound that cut through the silence. I grabbed the old hunting rifle and ran out onto the porch in my boxers. The truck was sitting exactly where I'd parked it. The lights weren't flashing. The alarm wasn't sounding. It was silent. I stood there, shivering, for 10 minutes, listening to the absolute, unbroken quiet, feeling like the sound I heard had been pushed directly into my head. The next night, it was something different. I was sleeping soundly when I woke up with the immediate, visceral sensation that someone was inside the house. Not the feeling of a break-in, but the certainty of a presence. My heart hammering, I got up and walked through the dark, empty rooms. Everything was locked. Nothing was out of place. But as I passed the hall mirror, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. A flicker of movement, low to the ground, just behind my ankles. When I spun around, there was nothing but the dark wood floor. This happened for 3 nights. The phantom truck alarm, the fleeting reflection, the internal certainty of another presence. The events were disconnected, but the effect was cumulative, a growing psychological dread. I started leaving every light in the house on, burning through my generator fuel. Then, the mimicry started. It was 2:15 a.m., and I was reading a paperback, trying to focus, when I heard a sound from outside that was horribly familiar, the distant, predictable moan of a midnight freight train rattling through the valley. This was the same train sound I used to hear in Albany, New York, where I grew up. The problem? There are no active train tracks within 100 miles of my ranch. I listened, paralyzed, as the sound continued. The rhythmic clickety-clack of the wheels on the rails, the lonely horn blast. It was perfect. It was a flawless sound portrait of something that didn't exist here. It felt like an audio hallucination, designed specifically for my ears, a piece of my past weaponized against my present isolation. The train sound faded away, leaving only the buzzing silence, and when I finally went to the window, the moon was high. I saw movement. A shape was standing right at the edge of the scrub brush, maybe 50 yards from the house. It was thin, too tall, and it was watching the house. I couldn't make out details, but it didn't look like a coyote or a deer. It was angled toward me, and then, from that shape, I heard it. My name, Kevin. It wasn't a shout. It was a soft, tentative whisper, delivered in the exact, unmistakable voice of my dead mother. The climax hit the following night. I was huddled in the kitchen, the rifle across my lap, too terrified to sleep. The dead of night arrived, and I didn't have to wait long. This time, the sounds came directly from the attic above my head. It started with the sound of a woman crying, low and mournful, but it wasn't my mother's voice. It sounded like an old, scratched-up record of a woman crying. Then, it shifted, becoming a series of short, frantic thumps, like a large bird trapped and slamming itself repeatedly against the rafters. Finally, the true terror, the trapped, frantic sounds morphed into something precise and deliberate, a loud, clear, repeated knocking, but it wasn't on the walls or the floor. It was the frantic, specific sound of knuckles rapping against the inside of the ceiling vent cover in the kitchen. Knock, 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 knock. It was a signal. I pointed the flashlight at the vent and saw the thin aluminum cover vibrating, ever so slightly. Then, the knocking stopped, and I heard a noise that was clearly, unmistakably, a human man clearing his throat, directly above the thin metal screen. A single, wet, preparatory ahem. Then, a new sound came through the vent, a deep, calm, Male voice speaking my exact GPS coordinates out loud, followed by a quiet, unsettling chuckle. It knew exactly where I was, and it was announcing it, to me, and to the endless, black desert. I left the next morning. I didn't pack anything. I just put the rifle down, got in the truck, and drove until the blacktop turned into the interstate, not looking in the rearview mirror once. The house is still out there, locked up, a monument to fear. I haven't sold it. I can't bring myself to go back, and I can't bear the thought of someone else moving in. I'm back in the city now, living on the 10th floor of an apartment building in downtown Los Angeles. I keep the windows locked and the blinds drawn. I'm safe here. There are sirens, horns, and people everywhere. But sometimes, when the city noise drops out for a brief, perfect second, I hear a new sound in the pre-dawn quiet. A sound I never heard in the desert, but one that has clearly followed me. The faint, unmistakable ping of an elevator arriving, followed by the soft, rhythmic click of heavy footsteps walking down the carpeted hall outside my locked front door. And I realized the silence out there in the desert wasn't empty. It was listening, learning, and recording. And now, its recordings are playing back, specifically for me, no matter how many miles I put between us. There's a reason people avoid the old logging roads deep in the Olympic National Forest, especially at night. It's not just the treacherous turns or the threat of a flat tire miles from anywhere. It's because some things prefer to stay hidden in the darkest shadows, and if you stumble upon their territory when the moon is high, you might just find that the forest has eyes, and they are not human. My name is Marc, and I've been a freelance photographer for 15 years. Specializing in forgotten Americana and unsettling landscapes. I grew up in a small town on the edge of the forest in Washington state, so the woods were my backyard. This familiarity bred a certain bravado. On a late autumn night, around 11 p.m., I decided to venture deeper than usual, chasing a rumored abandoned ranger station that promised incredible, eerie shots under a full moon. My old Jeep was reliable, my camera gear packed, and I had a thermos of coffee. The baseline of normalcy was the comforting drone of the Jeep's engine, the crunch of gravel under the tires, and the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. The first inkling of wrongness was when my GPS signal abruptly died, replaced by a garbled, static screech. I wasn't surprised. These old roads often had dead zones. I knew the general direction, so I kept driving, pushing further into the black, winding tunnels of ancient trees. The road became narrower, the canopy thicker, and the darkness absolute, save for my high beams cutting a yellow swathe through the inky blackness. The escalation began when I realized I was well and truly lost. I'd been driving for what felt like hours, the Jeep's fuel gauge steadily dropping. Every turn looked the same. The trees were monolithic, pressing in on either side. At around 1:30 a.m., I decided to pull over, shut off the engine, and consult my physical map by flashlight. The silence that descended was heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. As I unfolded the map, a flash of movement caught my eye. Deep in the tree line, beyond the reach of my headlights, I saw a pair of yellow-orange eyes. They were large, round, and perfectly still, reflecting the faint, ambient moonlight. Too high off the ground for a deer, too wide for a coyote. I stared, holding my breath, and after a long moment, they slowly, deliberately, blinked. Then they were gone. I told myself it was some nocturnal animal, a cougar perhaps, but the way they had blinked, so human-like, sent a shiver down my spine. I started the Jeep and drove on, faster now, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. A half hour later, I stopped again, convinced I saw something move in my rearview mirror. Nothing. But when I looked at the side of the road, directly beside my driver's window, a small, hand-carved wooden doll was lying on the moss. It was crudely made, with rough-hewn features and 2 black buttons for eyes. It hadn't been there a second before. I panicked, swerving the Jeep as I sped away, leaving the doll behind. A few miles further, the road opened into a small, desolate clearing. In the center, under the full moon, stood what looked like a dozen or more of those same crude wooden dolls, arranged in a perfect, silent circle. They were all facing inwards, their button eyes glinting. One of them, taller than the rest, had its back to me. As I slowed, feeling an icy dread crawl up my spine, the tallest doll slowly rotated on its axis, its head turning, until its button eyes were staring directly into my headlights. The climax arrived with a sickening jolt. I floored the accelerator, tearing out of the clearing, the images of those dolls seared into my mind. I took a sharp turn, praying it was the right direction, and then my headlights caught something else on the road ahead, something impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, and almost indistinct against the dense forest backdrop. It was standing in the middle of the logging road, blocking my path. It had the same proportions as a human, but it was far too tall, easily 9 or 10 feet, and incredibly slender. Its skin, or covering, seemed to absorb the light, making it a dark, wavering silhouette. As I got closer, I could make out details that made my blood run cold. Long, jointed limbs, and a head that was too small for its body, almost vestigial. But what truly paralyzed me was its face, or lack thereof. It was utterly smooth, featureless, like a piece of polished driftwood. Yet, somehow, I knew it was looking at me. And then it moved. It didn't step or walk. It flowed, a ripple of movement, across its unnaturally long body, and it started to shrink, telescoping down, becoming shorter and shorter, until it was the size of a child. And as it shrunk, 2 large, round, perfectly yellow-orange eyes slowly opened on its smooth, featureless face, reflecting my headlights with an ancient, predatory intelligence. The eyes were precisely the same color and shape as the pair I had seen blinking at me from the tree line hours earlier. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just feet from where the now child-sized, featureless entity with those burning eyes stood. It raised a long, thin arm, slowly, and pointed a finger with an impossibly long nail directly at my windshield. I backed up the Jeep, spun around, and drove in the opposite direction, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I drove until the sun began to rise, painting the sky with pale light, and only then did I find a paved road leading out of the forest, back to civilization. I never took another photo trip into the deep woods again. I sold my Jeep and bought a smaller car, one that sticks to the main roads. But every so often, when I'm driving at night, and the streetlights are sparse, I see it, just for a flicker. A pair of yellow-orange eyes, reflecting the distant brake lights of the car ahead, staring at me from the shadows of a roadside bush. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll hear a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, not on the walls, but on the outside of my window, high up on the 3rd floor. I know what's out there in the dark woods of the Olympic National Forest, and I know it remembers the night I drove through its territory. And sometimes, when I wake up in the dead of night, I wonder if the small, crude wooden doll I find on my porch in the morning, with its black button eyes, is meant as a warning or an invitation. They say the Blackwood Hotel in Denver, Colorado, never gives up its guests. I didn't believe it. Not until I stood in room 712 on a Tuesday night and realized the silence wasn't empty. It was just waiting to be filled by the sound of a breath that wasn't mine. My name is Clara, and I'm a travel writer who thrives on finding and debunking local legends. The Blackwood, built in 1910, was a perfect subject. It's a huge, imposing granite structure downtown, famous for its elaborate Gilded Age fixtures and its infamous history, the site of a bizarre double suicide in 1947, followed by a boiler room explosion that claimed 3 lives in the 1970s. Management today embraces the haunted label, but I was there for the history and the atmosphere, not the ghosts. My assignment was to spend 3 nights in one of the allegedly most active rooms, room 712, on the top floor. The room itself was gorgeous, all dark wood, velvet curtains, and a stunning view of the city lights. The baseline of normalcy was the reassuring sound of the city, distant police sirens, the gentle murmur of traffic, and the occasional rush of the old pipes in the walls. The initial wrongness was minor. The window latch was broken, allowing a persistent, icy draft, even when the window was fully closed. I mentioned it to the front desk. They promised maintenance, but no one ever came. It was just a small, cold spot in an otherwise opulent room. The escalation began on the first night, just after midnight. I was lying in the massive 4-poster bed, reading, when I felt a peculiar sensation on the sheets near my feet. It felt like a small, continuous vibration, a tremor, like a cell phone set to silent alert and buried deep beneath the pillows. I checked. Nothing. I felt it again, persistent and irritating. I pulled back the heavy sheets, ran my hands across the mattress, but found nothing. The tremor stopped the moment my hand touched the spot. I passed it off as stress or the vibrations from the old building's infrastructure. But the next night, it returned, closer this time, near my side. I shifted, and the vibration ceased, replaced by a new, far more unsettling phenomenon, the smell of ozone, sharp and electric, combined with the faint, unmistakable aroma of old, burning cigar smoke, a scent that clung to the air for a minute before vanishing completely. The room was strictly non-smoking. The most acute series of events started on the 3rd night. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up not by a sound, but by the pressure change. My ears popped hard, as if the altitude had suddenly shifted by 1,000 feet. Immediately afterward, the air became so cold I could see my own breath. A wispy cloud in the dark room, despite the central heating being cranked up. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. Then I heard it. A low, scraping sound coming from the bathroom, followed by a faint, high-pitched worry. I slowly climbed out of bed, reached for the lamp, and turned it on. The room flooded with light. I moved toward the bathroom door, stopping dead when I saw what was on the wall above the writing desk. The heavy velvet curtain, which I had closed tightly before going to sleep, was now slightly ajar, just enough to reveal the icy blackness outside. And traced into the thick dust on the glass of the window, drawn with a precise finger, was a large, perfect spiral, extending from the bottom corner of the pane, spinning inward to a central point. The climax was swift and terrifying. I was staring at the spiral, my mind racing, convinced that something, was trapped inside the room with me. I backed away from the window, reaching for the phone to call security, when the temperature dropped again, drastically. The breath I exhaled was a cloud. I looked toward the bathroom, where the light was still on, and saw the reflection in the polished wood of the wardrobe door, standing directly behind me. Almost touching my shoulder was a figure. It was tall, indistinct, and wearing something long and dark, like an old trench coat, and it had its head bowed, but its hand was the worst. It was long, impossibly thin, and held a small, antique, silver-plated straight razor. As I watched the reflection, paralyzed by fear, the figure slowly lifted its head. I couldn't make out its features, but its entire body began to visibly vibrate, the movement accelerating until the air around it seemed to shimmer, making the light in the reflection blur and distort. The razor-wielding hand lifted, and just as I screamed, the sound of an incredibly loud, resonant inhaler, huge, deep, gasping breaths, sounded right beside my ear. The force of it was so strong it actually ruffled the hair on the back of my neck. I burst out of the room, slamming the door shut, and sprinted down the hall to the nearest elevator, leaving my phone and bags behind. I pounded the lobby button repeatedly, finally collapsing against the wall as the ancient elevator cage descended, the grinding mechanism screaming in protest. I checked out immediately, paying the bill in cash, and drove straight to the airport, never looking back at the granite monolith that was the Blackwood Hotel. I'm back home now, miles away in Phoenix, Arizona, but the experience hasn't left me. I still feel cold spots in my apartment, and sometimes I'll catch a faint, brief whiff of burning cigar smoke. The true haunting, however, is what I found when I finally unpacked the camera I had with me that night. In the memory card, there was one photograph, taken automatically by the camera's motion sensor in the dark of room 712, an hour before I woke up. It's blurry, unfocused, just a shot of the empty corner of the room, but in the very center, impossibly clear and precise against the dark background, is a single, isolated, sharp, silver straight razor, laid perfectly flat on the dark velvet carpet. And every night, I find myself checking the air in my bedroom, taking a quiet, shallow breath, just to make sure that the one I took is the only one I hear. The Juniper Inn in northern Michigan stands on a bluff overlooking Lake Superior, its white clapboard exterior peeling like sunburnt skin. The locals whispered that the lake never let go of the souls it claimed, and that the inn was simply where they came to dry off. I didn't care about the ghosts. I was there for the isolation. But when the night fell, I realized the isolation wasn't peaceful, it was a deep, cold communion. My name is David, and I'm a musician who travels to remote places to write. I need silence to create, and the Juniper Inn, closed for the season save for a few maintenance workers and me, promised absolute quiet. It was late October, and the place was a massive, empty wooden shell, smelling of dust and pine. One rented the smallest room on the third floor, room 303, which faced the massive churning gray expanse of the lake. My intention was to stay for 2 weeks. The baseline of normalcy was the constant, rhythmic crash of the waves far below. A natural white noise, occasionally punctuated by the mournful blast of a freighter horn out on the water. The initial wrongness was the clock. There was a small, ornate, antique mantel clock on the dresser in my room, and it ticked, not loudly, but with a stiff, heavy clack instead of a light tick. The maintenance man who checked me in assured me it didn't work and hadn't run in years. But I heard it, and every time I looked, the hands were frozen at 4:17. The escalation began the following night, after I'd settled into my writing routine. I was working late, around 1 a.m., when the faint, low sound of music drifted up the stairwell. It was piano music, specifically an old, melancholy ragtime tune, played clumsily, as if by a child who was just learning the notes. I went to the door, opened it a crack, and listened. The sound was coming from the grand ballroom on the main floor, 2 flights down. I told myself it was one of the maintenance crew, practicing on the old upright. But the next night, the music was different. It was the same ragtime piece, but this time, it was played perfectly, professionally, and with a raw, heartbreaking emotion. It lasted for 30 seconds, then cut off mid-note, replaced by a sudden, heavy, slamming sound, like a large book hitting a wooden floor directly below me. I listened, terrified, for a half hour, but there was nothing more than the lake noise. The true, crippling dread set in on the third night. I decided to try and record the sounds. I placed a small, sensitive audio recorder by the door and went to bed. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound that was neither music nor a crash. It was the distinct, repeated sound of a wet mop slopping across a wooden floor, coming from the empty room directly above me. Room 403. It was a rhythmic, awful slosh scrape, moving back and forth in slow, deliberate passes. I knew for a fact that the entire fourth floor was empty, stripped bare for eventual renovation. I got out of bed, went to my door, and stood listening to the sound of something heavy and wet being dragged and cleaned above me. It was relentless. I considered calling the front desk, but the noise suddenly stopped. The silence rushed back in, broken only by a single, sharp, drip, drip, drip sound, which was coming from the exact center of my room's ceiling. I looked up and saw a fresh, dark, wet spot forming. The climax was unexpected and paralyzing. I threw on a jacket and, flashlight in hand, crept out of my room and up the main staircase to the fourth floor, determined to find the source of the noise. The fourth floor was pitch black and freezing. The hallway smelled strongly of bleach and cold seawater. I walked down the hall to room 403. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, dusty, with the bed stripped down to the bare metal frame. There was no one there. The floorboards were bone dry. I turned to leave, dismissing the whole thing as my mind playing tricks on me in the overwhelming silence, when I heard a sound from the hallway behind me, the heavy, stiff clack of the clock ticking, but impossibly loud, as if it was right next to my ear. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight beam down the hall. Nothing. The sound was coming from the wall beside the door. I put my ear to the paper-thin wall, and the ticking stopped. It was replaced by a soft, wet sound, like someone slowly exhaling through chapped lips, emanating from inside the wall. Then, a woman's voice, muffled and echoing, whispered one clear sentence, "It's not for 17 yet." I ran. I didn't stop to pack or collect my recorder. I drove my car straight onto the nearest ferry heading south, leaving the Juniper Inn and its lonely lighthouse behind. I never got my money back, and I never finished that album. I'm living in a busy city again, composing music for commercials. The haunting, however, didn't stay on the bluff. A few months ago, I was moving a dresser in my new apartment, and when I pulled it away from the wall, I found a small, dark, damp stain on the wallpaper, right in the center. I cleaned it, but it never fully went away. And sometimes, when the city is quietest, I hear a new sound, the soft, rhythmic clack of a heavy antique clock starting to tick somewhere far away, followed by the terrifying realization that I have no idea what time it is, or how long I've been asleep. The Cadence Towers in downtown Chicago is one of those places that looks like an office building but operates as a luxury hotel, all glass, steel, and anonymity. It's infamous for its 1990s construction tragedy, where a construction worker vanished without a trace inside the ventilation system. I thought it was just urban myth. I was wrong. The hotel doesn't just hold its history. It keeps a guest list of the missing. My name is Ellis, and I was in Chicago for a tech conference, booked into a standard room on the 19th floor. The Cadence Towers was impersonal, modern, and high above the noise, exactly what I wanted. The baseline of normalcy was the faint, constant whoosh of the air conditioning, the low rumble of the elevators, and the sight of my own reflection in the sleek glass walls. The initial wrongness was the bathroom mirror. It was immaculate, but whenever I looked into it, the air inside the reflection seemed perpetually foggy, like a film had been spread over the glass on the other side. I tried to clean it countless times, but the fog persisted, always just thick enough to obscure my reflection slightly. The escalation began on the first night. I was woken around 3 a.m. by a high-pitched metallic screech that seemed to come from directly above me. It sounded exactly like the sound of metal grinding against concrete, a terrible, grinding sound that went on for 20 seconds before stopping abruptly. I assumed it was construction work in the adjoining building, though it was a strange hour. The next night, the sound was different. It came from the wall next to my bed and was a soft, rhythmic scratching, like small, frantic fingers dragging across drywall. It moved, traveling horizontally along the entire length of the wall before stopping directly over the headboard. I knocked on the wall, and the scratching ceased instantly, followed by a sound that made my skin crawl, a low, quiet, sustained cough, muffled, as if coming from deep within the plaster. The cough was immediately followed by a sound that was even worse, the faint, tiny, almost musical sound of a human bell. The true dread arrived on the third night. I was trying to sleep, staring at the ceiling, when I realized the low whoosh of the air conditioning was no longer constant. It was cycling. It would whoosh for 3 seconds, stop for 5, then whoosh again. I tracked the cycle mentally, focusing on the dark vent high on the ceiling. As I stared, I saw the vent covers slowly begin to rattle, a soft, vibrating metal sound. Then, from inside the vent, a low, breathy voice whispered a single word, completely audible over the mechanical noise: down. The vent cover then popped out of its frame and fell to the carpet with a soft thud, revealing the black, empty shaft. I sat up quickly, flashlight aimed at the dark hole. I saw nothing, but the air suddenly smelled faintly of old dust and stale, metallic sweat. Then, I heard the sound again, clearer this time, the delicate, rhythmic ringing of a small, brass bell, coming from inside the ventilation shaft. It wasn't random. It was for short, rapid rings, a distinct, repeated pattern, like an archaic signal. I realized the sound was coming from below me, traveling up the shaft. The climax occurred moments later. I was dialing 911 when the ringing stopped. It was replaced by a rapid succession of loud, heavy metallic thumps not on the walls, but on the outside of the ventilation duct itself. Moving rapidly up toward the 19th floor, the thumping intensified, getting closer, sounding less like a metal object and more like a contained, frantic climbing inside the walls. I dropped the phone and backed away to the door. Just as I reached the handle, the thumping stopped abruptly, right at my level. And then, from the black hole of the open vent, something impossibly thin and gray shot out, hitting the floor with a wet, squelching sound. It was a piece of fabric, a large, shredded, filthy piece of a blue denim sleeve, cut off cleanly at the elbow. As I stared at it, horrified, I heard a final, chilling sound, a faint, low-level radio static that seemed to emanate not from the vent, but from the piece of denim itself, a low, continuous, almost inaudible hissing that sounded like countless trapped voices. I never returned to that hotel room. I checked out at 4 a.m., leaving everything behind. I filed a police report about the strange object, but they found nothing, blaming old building debris. I'm back home now, and I'm fine, mostly, but I can't shake the fear I developed of confined spaces, and every night, I find myself compulsively checking the ventilation registers in my apartment. The true terror, the one that lingers, is the knowledge that I am not alone in my current space, because whenever I press my ear close to the metal grid of my central heating vent, and the fan is off, I can hear a soft, constant sound, very faint but undeniably present, coming from the pipes deep inside the wall, the slow, repetitive, and steady ringing of a tiny brass bell. I don't know how long it's been since I slept through the night. 6 months, a year. It's not the nightmare that wakes me. It's the sheer, cold certainty that I am being watched. It started small, a misplaced item, a shadow at the periphery of the living room window. But now, I know the difference between paranoia and the horrible. quiet presence of another person who knows my every habit, my every move, and who, somehow, seems to be breathing the same air. I moved to this quiet subdivision in upstate New York for the peace. A modest, 2-story house on a dead-end street, surrounded by old maple and oak trees. I'm a graphic designer. I work from home, and the solitude was supposed to be a gift. For the first few months, it was. The only sounds were the wind in the eaves and the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. I'm meticulous, maybe a little obsessive. Keys go on the hook, mail goes into the shredder immediately, windows are always locked. So when I found the spare Keitha one, I kept hidden beneath a decorative garden gnome by the front porch, lying innocently on the welcome mat. I rationalized it. Maybe the neighborhood cat knocked it over. Maybe the gnome just settled. I picked it up, replaced it, and forgot about it until 2 weeks later. That's when the small, nondescript white van started appearing. Not parked outside my house, but a block away, near the entrance to the cul-de-sac. It was always there around 3 p.m., just when I finished my major client work and took a coffee break on the porch. The van was never occupied, or at least, I never saw anyone get in or out. It was just a blank, white canvas of anonymity. Then came the mail. Nothing overtly threatening, just small things that chipped away at my sanity. A single postcard of the Golden Gate Bridge, a place I'd only mentioned once in an obscure social media post years ago. Then, a package of my favorite tea brand, Darjeeling. A specific blend I could only find at one specialty shop in the next town over. No note, no sender address, just the tea. It felt like a perverse gift from a secret admirer, but the admirer was studying me with terrifying precision. I called the non-emergency police line. They took my information, offered a boilerplate suggestion about installing cameras, and closed the case within 10 minutes. I was on my own. I bought the cameras the next day, 4 of them, covering every angle of the house. The setup was tedious, drilling into the siding, running the wires through the attic, but I felt a small surge of control. I watched the feeds constantly, the front yard, the back deck, the driveway. The white van was still there, a silent sentinel. The real terror began one Tuesday night. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, and glanced at the monitor. The feed for the back deck flickered a millisecond of static, followed by a momentary darkening of the image. I dismissed it as a power surge, but when I looked closer, I saw it. The outdoor light on the deck, which was off, was casting a faint, almost imperceptible shadow. It was tall, thin, and static, pressed flat against the wall, just out of the camera's direct view. My breath hitched. I dropped the knife. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs, watching that shadow not move, not breathe, just be. It was the outline of a person, standing perfectly still, positioned exactly in the camera's blind spot, a spot they had to know existed. I crept to the kitchen window, peering through a slit in the blinds, but the deck was empty, bathed in the normal gloom of the night. The shadow on the screen was gone. I checked the recording. The flicker, the shadow, then nothing. I didn't want to go out there, but I had to know. Clutching a heavy wrench, I unlocked the back door, swung it open, and flicked on the deck light. Everything was normal. The grill, the 2 empty chairs, the potted plants, until I saw the small, white chalk mark on the deck railing. It was a simple arrow, pointing directly to the corner where the camera had been unable to see. A casual, confident signature. The incident that broke me happened 2 days later. I was in the middle of a video conference, presenting mock-ups to a client on the West Coast. My focus was absolute. I was clicking through slides, my voice clear and professional. Mid-sentence, I noticed something strange in my peripheral vision, in the reflection of my darkened computer screen. There was a slight shift in the air behind me, near the hallway. I paused my presentation, my blood turning to ice water. I slowly turned my head, careful not to alert the client to the terror crawling up my spine. The hallway was empty. But then my eyes caught the small, black fabric rectangle lying on the floor, just outside my office door. It was the cloth cleaning patch for my glasses. The one I kept in a small, closed drawer on my desk. A drawer I had locked 5 minutes before the conference started. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just been watching from the street. They had been in the house, not just watching the shadow, but actively demonstrating their presence while I was on a live video call. They could have been standing 10 feet behind me, knowing I couldn't scream without causing a scene. The subtle, silent breach of my personal space, the key, the gift, the shadow, the cloth, it was all building to this one horrifying realization of proximity. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it, and dialed 911. As I stumbled over the words, trying to explain the unexplainable to the dispatcher, I heard it, a faint, almost musical sound, like a single key from a piano. It came from the floor above me, from the attic access panel. C-sharp, a note I hadn't heard since I was 10 years old, practicing on the family piano. I left that house that night, locking the door on my way out, but not before I stood in the driveway and stared at the dark, second-story window. And that's when I saw it. The curtains in my spare bedroom, which I always kept closed, were pulled back about an inch, just enough for someone to be looking out. The white van was gone, but the presence wasn't. I'm renting a small apartment now, 3 states away, but every time I look out the window, every time I hear a strange sound in the ventilation, I know the distance doesn't matter. They didn't want the house or my possessions. They wanted the knowledge of me, and they took it. I still get the postcards sometimes. Always an American landmark, always from a different city, always arriving just as I start to feel safe. The moment I saw the blue sticky note on my dashboard, I knew. It wasn't the violation of the car that struck me first, it was the color. I only ever used blue sticky notes. The paper was the same brand I bought in bulk from the office supply store near my job in downtown Seattle. Written on it, in careful block letters, was a single word: watch. No exclamation point, no signature, just the bare, unsettling command. I hadn't even parked in a garage. This was out in the open, in the crowded employee lot of the software company where I worked. How long had they been watching to know my preferred stationery? I'm a data analyst. My life revolves around predictable patterns, spreadsheets, and the absolute logic of numbers. I live alone in an apartment complex just outside Redmond, a place where people keep to themselves and the biggest worry is finding a good parking spot. After the first note, I started checking my car religiously, before and after work. Nothing. Days blurred into weeks of high-alert normalcy. The logical part of my brain screamed, coincidence, a prank, a coworker. But the primal part was whispering something colder. The notes returned. This time, they were left inside my apartment. I found the second one tucked into my laptop keyboard, placed precisely under the F1 key. It read, "Listen." The third was inside a carton of milk I had just bought, sealed and floating near the top. "Stop." This escalation was the genius of it. No forced entry, no alarms tripped, just the quiet, absolute certainty that a boundary I thought impenetrable had been crossed, repeatedly. I lived on the 3rd floor. My windows overlooked a courtyard, too high for casual observation. I changed the locks, installed a simple chain bolt, and started documenting everything. I noted the date, time, location, and the precise wording of each note, treating it like a statistical anomaly I needed to understand. I began leaving small tells myself. Piece of tape on the window seam, a hair across the doorknob, but every time, they remained undisturbed. Yet, the notes kept coming, each one more personal and psychologically tailored than the last. They stopped being single words and became short, unnerving phrases. The creepiest notes often appeared when I was asleep. I would wake up, walk into the kitchen to make coffee, and see one affixed to the magnetic knife block where it hadn't been the night before. One morning, the note read, "You hum when you load the dishwasher. It's a Jeep." It was true. I did that. An insignificant, private quirk I wasn't even conscious of. Another time, I was working late on a project, stressed, and talking to myself under my breath, a habit I hated. The next morning, a note was slipped under my bedroom door. "The deadline is Monday. You'll make it. Don't worry." These weren't threats. They were endorsements. Affirmations that felt infinitely more terrifying than a simple "I will hurt you." It was an absolute assertion of intimacy I had never granted. It felt less like being stalked and more like being groomed by a predator. I became a prisoner of my own habits. I stopped humming. I stopped talking to myself. I wore noise-canceling headphones even when I wasn't listening to music. I tried to introduce random elements into my routine, taking different routes to work, changing grocery stores. But the notes proved my efforts futile. One Saturday, I spontaneously drove 3 hours east into the Cascades, rented a remote cabin for the night, and ate takeout alone. When I got back into my apartment on Sunday, there was a sticky note on the bathroom mirror. It was white this time, a new variable. It simply said, "Did the mountains clear your head?" Underneath, drawn with almost casual speed, was a simple, stylized sketch of the exact cabin I had rented. No address, no town, just the visual proof that the distance I had sought was meaningless. The climax of this insidious campaign happened at work. I was alone in my cube, running a massive data aggregation query, the office nearly empty. My mouse suddenly felt odd. I lifted my hand and stared at the dark, matte finish of the ergonomic device. Stuck to the underside, almost completely hidden from view, was the final note. It was smaller than the others, folded over twice. I unfolded it slowly, the silence of the large, empty office pressing down on me. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. It read, "The blue sticky notes are in the third drawer, down, top right." My stomach dropped out. The blue sticky notes, the specific brand, the entire pad, were in a small, seldom used filing cabinet under my desk. They were locked away, and the key was on a chain I never let go of. This meant they didn't just know I had them. They had been here, in my cube, during working hours, with the confidence to rummage through my locked files. I looked up, spinning my chair around, scanning the silent rows of cubicles, the deserted halls. I felt the cold realization that my entire world, the sanctity of my home, the security of my workplace, the solitude of my thoughts, had been completely breached, not by force, but by a quiet, calculating intelligence. I quit my job the next day. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and left the apartment key taped to the management office door, abandoning the security deposit and everything that couldn't fit. I moved 3,000 miles away to a different state, changed my name, and cut off all social media. I'm living under the radar now, working freelance, but I still check the underside of every surface I touch. I don't use sticky notes anymore, and sometimes, when I'm walking home, I catch myself humming a G-flat, and the cold, awful certainty floods back. They aren't gone. They're just waiting for the next opportunity to leave a message. I still keep my phone off speaker when I'm alone, even years later. It's a habit born from the absolute certainty that the person on the other end is listening, not just to my words, but to the inflection, the silences, the atmosphere of the room. It was never about what they said, it was about what they already knew. I was living in a small, historic town near Annapolis, Maryland, teaching high school English. My life was public in the quiet, small-town way. I had a regular table at the local coffee shop. I went to the same gym every Tuesday and Thursday, and I walked my golden retriever, Barnaby, around the community lake at 6 a.m. sharp. I was a routine. The first hint was the phone calls. They had no sound on the other end, just a dead air that stretched on for minutes. I initially wrote it off as a bad connection or telemarketers. The calls came once a day, then twice, then 4 or 5 times, always from a blocked number. The tone of the silence changed though. It progressed from dead air to something that sounded like controlled, shallow breathing. When I would finally hang up, the phone would ring back instantly. It felt like I was failing a test, that by hanging up, I was giving the observer exactly the reaction they wanted, frustrated and slightly rattled. One night a call came through, and instead of silence, I heard a single, distinct sound, the click of a cigarette lighter igniting. I don't smoke, but my neighbor, Mr. Harrison, used to light up on his porch every night, around 9. The stalking accelerated with a calculated surgical intrusion into my routines. Barnaby, my dog, became the focus. One Tuesday, I let him out into the fenced backyard before heading to the gym. When I returned an hour later, I noticed the dog had chewed through one of his rubber squeaky toys, the tough blue one he loved. It was shredded, but on the center of my worn, faded deck, right next to the wreckage of the toy, was a perfectly new, identical blue, squeaky toy. It hadn't been there when I left. The thought of someone climbing my fence, replacing the dog's toy in the brief hour I was gone, and leaving no trace, turned my blood cold. It was a statement of access, a demonstration of competence. I stopped taking Barnaby to the lake. I changed my gym hours. I started driving a long, convoluted route to work. The calls stopped, but the surveillance only intensified. I started finding things inside my house that didn't belong. A small, shiny button, the kind you'd find on a wool coat resting on the rim of my coffee mug. A single, perfectly preserved autumn leaf, brown and crisp, placed precisely on the center of my bedside table. These weren't overt they were phantom intrusions. The button was too small to feel like a threat, the leaf too innocent, but the context was shattering. It meant they were moving through my life, knowing my schedule so perfectly that they could slip in and out of the house unseen, perhaps while I was out walking Barnaby for 5 minutes, or maybe even while I was asleep in the next room. I reached a point where I didn't trust my own eyes. I started leaving things out of place deliberately, a coaster askew, a magazine upside down, and the stalker would correct them. I would come home to find the coaster centered, the magazine neatly righted. It was an unnerving, silent correction, a passive-aggressive suggestion that my life was messy and they were here to restore order. The fear didn't scream, it whispered, eroding my sense of reality. My classroom became the only safe haven, a public space filled with other people, but even that was violated. One afternoon, I returned from the staff lounge to find the quote I had written on the whiteboard, a line from The Great Gatsby, had been corrected. My quote was, "So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." The word past had been neatly underlined, and in precise script next to it, the word present was written, a personalized, chilling piece of literary criticism. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the basement, doing laundry, a place I rarely went. It was dusty, dim, and separated from the main house. As I pulled a load from the dryer, I looked up at the small, narrow basement window, which was at ground level. The window was covered by thick, dried dirt and spiderwebs, making it impossible to see through. But as I watched, a small, circular spot was suddenly wiped clean on the center of the pane, revealing a small, dark patch of the world outside. And then, an eye appeared in that spot. It was a dark eye, framed by a thick, heavy brow, completely unblinking. It was the eye of someone watching, waiting, patiently, I didn't scream or run. I stood there, frozen, my fingers gripping the damp towels. The eye didn't move. It was utterly still, observing me in the dusty gloom. It wasn't a flash of movement or a fleeting shadow. It was a definitive, protracted moment of mutual observation. This was the peak of the fear. The moment where the watchers stopped hiding and simply presented themselves as an absolute fixture of my reality. I felt my lungs seize up. It was only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the eye blinked, once, heavily, and disappeared as the spot was slowly wiped over again, restoring the layer of dirt and obscuring the window completely. I'd never heard the footsteps or the sound of someone running away. I went upstairs, called the police, and filed a detailed report. But without any physical evidence or threat, their hands were tied. I sold the house 3 weeks later, moving cross-country to San Diego. I'm a completely different person now. I've changed my appearance. I work entirely remotely, and I live in an upper-floor apartment with no ground-level windows. But I know the stalking wasn't about the location or the house. It was about me. Every time I get a notification that my spam folder has caught a new email, or when my dog stares intently at a fixed point on the ceiling, I feel the same chill. I understand that the feeling of being watched is not just an emotion. It is a permanent state of being, a psychological imprint that the stalker left behind, a terrifying, unseen roommate I will carry for the rest of my life. The worst part about the footage wasn't what I saw, but the fraction of a second when I realized the camera was looking back. I'm not talking about a reflection or a light flare. I mean a deliberate, targeted focus on, acknowledgement that someone, or something, knew exactly where the lens was and was using it to communicate. I live in a quiet, modern townhouse development near Phoenix, Arizona. A place where the sun burns out any shadows before they can even form. I installed a comprehensive security system, 3 cameras covering the front porch, the backyard, and the garage entry, mostly as a deterrent against package theft. The feeds were piped directly to a monitor in my home office, a constant, comforting presence of surveillance. For the first few months, the footage was mind-numbingly boring. The mail carrier, the neighborhood kids playing ball, the occasional stray cat batting at a leaf. It was the epitome of suburban normalcy, a baseline of absolute security. The first anomaly was minor. The front porch camera, which had a wide-angle lens, would occasionally show an empty space where my welcome mat should have been. I'd check, and there it was, right outside my door. I dismissed it as a glitch in the cheap camera's software. Maybe a slight shift in the field of view that cropped the bottom edge of the frame. But then the mat started reappearing, always centered, always perfectly aligned. It was a subtle, almost insulting demonstration that someone was moving an object inside the camera's view, precisely when the camera was supposedly glitching. The oddities began to escalate, focusing on the backyard camera. This camera watched over a small concrete patio and a 6-foot privacy fence. Its motion alerts were highly sensitive. One night, the alert went off at 2 a.m. I checked the feed, expecting a raccoon. What I saw was a white cloth tied to the fence post, flapping in the slight desert breeze. It looked like a handkerchief. I waited, watching the feed. After about 30 seconds, the alert went off again. The white cloth was gone. I spent a full hour scrutinizing the playback. The cloth didn't fall. It was pulled up, vanishing over the top of the 6-foot fence, too fast and too smoothly to be snagged by the wind. The motion sensor was triggered both when it appeared and when it vanished. But what pulled it? I had a floodlight on the patio, and the footage was clear. There was nothing visible but the fence, the patio, and the stark night sky. I started reviewing the feeds constantly, looking for anything out of the ordinary, and soon I found the pattern. The cameras weren't just showing me reality. They were showing me a series of staged vignettes. The backdoor camera, positioned high on the wall, showed the small garden snake I'd seen earlier that day. In the evening playback, the snake appeared again. It slithered across the pavement, but instead of moving toward the bushes, it coiled into a neat, perfect spiral directly beneath the lens, pausing for a full minute before slithering away. On another night, the camera focused on the front of my garage, picked up a child's red tricycle, one I had never seen standing upright in the middle of my driveway. It stood there for 2 hours, completely still, until, in a single frame change, it was gone. The worst part was realizing the timing of the events. They never happened when I was watching the live feed. They were always recorded, always anomalies that required me to review the playback later, ensuring the creepiness was retroactive, sinking in when I was relaxed and alone. The person, or entity, staging these events knew my sleep cycle, knew when I checked the feeds, and knew how to manipulate the camera's motion sensors with unsettling precision. I decided to try to catch them in the act. I pulled an all-nighter, sipping cold coffee and staring at the 4 quadrants of my security monitor. The house was silent. The screens were static, showing only the unchanging reality of my property. I saw nothing. Exhausted, I finally collapsed into bed at 6 a.m. When I woke up at noon, my heart immediately started pounding. I knew something had happened. I stumbled to the office and hit play on the recorded footage. The recordings from 6 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. were the key. On the backyard feed, at exactly 6:07 a.m., a large, dark gardening trowel appeared, planted handle down in the exact center of my patio. It stood there, upright and alone, a bizarre monument. I watched the timestamp tick. At 6:15 a.m., the trowel suddenly bent. Not snapped, but slowly, unnaturally curved until it rested, completely flat, on the concrete. The sound design of the camera's built-in microphone caught nothing but the sound of distant birds. No footsteps, no metallic creaking. Then came the front porch feed. At 6:25 a.m., the camera's lens, which was fixed and unmoving, suddenly seemed to shift. The wide-angle perspective narrowed slightly, as if it was zooming in, though my camera didn't have that capability. It focused on the reflection of the lens in the glass of the storm dorm my own house reflected back at itself. And then, in that reflection, a shape appeared, filling the entire frame. It was the vague, indistinct outline of a person, standing directly behind the camera. Not outside the camera's view, but directly on the camera, pressed against the housing, their shadow covering the lens. The reflection became a dark, distorted, almost liquid-like eye, and that's when the focus changed. The camera's autofocus mechanism, which usually struggles with distant objects, suddenly clicked into crystal clarity, focusing perfectly on the shadow. The person behind the lens wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was an acknowledgement. The feed then went black for 3 hours. I ripped the cameras out of the walls that afternoon, leaving gaping holes in the stucco. I changed the locks, but I knew it was useless. The surveillance wasn't external, it was internal. I live without cameras now, preferring the ignorance of not knowing to the certainty of being curated. But every time I walk out onto the back patio, I feel a prickle on the back of my neck. And sometimes, when I look through the front window, I think I see a light on my neighbor's porch, flicker not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate, artificial blink. It feels like the eye of a camera, reminding me that the lens is always present, even if I'm no longer the one watching the feed. My job was to watch them, but in the end, it was the camera that ended up watching me. I worked night security for a small, 2-story apartment complex outside Dallas, Texas. It was an easy gig: sit in a cramped office, stare at 12 monitors showing the parking lot, the main entrance, the pool area, and the laundry room, and log the occasional loud party or unauthorized vehicle. The entire system was old, relying on grainy, black and white analog cameras, the kind that cast everything in that perpetual, unsettling film noir aesthetic. The piece of the job was broken one Tuesday night by the laundry room feed. The laundry room was in the basement, a long, concrete corridor with 8 washing machines and 8 dryers. The camera was mounted high in the corner. I noticed a small anomaly: a piece of clothing, maybe a sock or a rag, left on top of the second washing machine from the left. It was a common occurrence, easily dismissed. But as I watched, the sock began to move. It didn't fall. It slid slowly, deliberately, across the top of the machine, as if pulled by an invisible thread, until it reached the edge and vanished. I rewound the footage, heart rate starting to climb. There was no breeze, no vibration, no visible hand, just the slow, impossible translation of a piece of fabric across a stationary surface. I chalked it up to an extreme case of static electricity and the aging cameras. But the events became bolder. The following week, the motion sensor for the pool area triggered at 4 a.m. I watched the feed, and the pool was empty, the water black and still under the solitary yellow sodium lamp. But at the edge of the screen, where the chaise lounge chairs were stacked for the winter, I saw it, a shadow. It was impossibly thin and tall, stretching vertically up the wall of the complex, defying the angle of the light. It wasn't cast by anything physical. It simply was a dark, rippling distortion against the stucco. It slowly elongated, growing thinner and thinner, until it resembled a stretched human figure, like someone pressed into the wall by immense pressure. I called the complex manager, but by the time he arrived 20 minutes later, the shadow was gone. The events that truly broke my composure involved the camera facing the main parking lot. This camera had a time-lapse function that I would occasionally use to review the whole night quickly. I started seeing cars that shouldn't be there, only to have them vanish in the next frame, not driven away, poof, gone. And then there were the figures, in the grainy, compressed time-lapse footage. They looked like smears of motion, fast-forwarded ghosts zipping across the asphalt. One morning, I caught a sequence that was only 3 seconds long in real time, but it stood out: a figure standing by a darkened van, holding something to its mouth. In the next frame, the figure was gone. I zoomed in on the van. Painted crudely on its rear window was a message: "Are you still watching?" This wasn't just a threat. It was a dialogue. The stalker knew I was watching the cameras, and they were using the feeds as their own personal stage. I realized that my logbook, where I diligently noted every anomaly, was an inadvertent communication system. They were leaving clues for me. Driven by a horrible mix of fear and professional duty, I started paying attention to the most insignificant details. I stopped using the time-lapse and watched the live feed every second. I noticed that one of the black and white monitors, the one showing the main entrance, developed a single dead pixel, a tiny, bright white speck right in the center of the screen. The climax happened during a late-night storm. The rain was drumming hard on the roof of the security office, and the wind was howling. The power flickered, and all the screens went momentarily dark, then sputtered back to life. As the monitors reset, I saw the laundry room feed the same old basement corridor, but this time, something was different. A figure, silhouetted in the dim light, was standing in the middle of the aisle, facing the camera. It was tall, indistinct, and unnervingly still. I leaned forward, gripping the desk, trying to make out any detail in the poor resolution, and then, the figure slowly raised its arm, pointing directly at the camera. But it wasn't pointing at the lens, it was pointing at the monitor in front of me. At the exact spot of the dead pixel, A wave of absolute paralyzing certainty washed over me. The dead pixel wasn't a flaw in the screen, it was a marker. The stalker wasn't just aware of the cameras. They were standing right in front of one, pointing at the singular flaw on my monitor, proving that they knew exactly what I was looking at. They were looking through the lens and seeing the output of the screen I was watching. Before I could process the impossibility of the technical knowledge required to do that, the figure slowly, deliberately, placed their hand over the lens of the camera. The screen went a solid, blinding white, the color of a blank wall. I quit the job immediately. I drove away from that apartment complex that morning and never looked back, leaving the white screen glaring behind me. I work as a delivery driver now, never staying in one place for long. I refuse to have any camera in my life, not on my phone, not on my computer. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and I catch my reflection in the dark glass of the side window, I notice a tiny, bright white speck reflected in my eye, and for a heart-stopping moment, I wonder if the dead pixel followed me, a tiny, silent reminder that I am still being observed. The horror of the last 6 months isn't that I found a ghost on my camera system. It's that the ghost learned to use the interface. I'm a software engineer living outside of Denver, Colorado, in a remote cabin I bought to escape the noise of the city. My security setup was top of the line. 3 wireless, high-definition cameras covering the perimeter, all controlled by a centralized hub with a custom user interface I designed myself. It was completely isolated from the internet, a fortress of pure local network security. I felt safe. The first incident involved a garage camera. I had set up a function on the software that highlighted any significant change in light, temperature, or motion within the frame. At 4:13 a.m., one Thursday, the garage camera triggered an alert, classifying the event as an unknown heat signature. The accompanying footage showed nothing but the usual stacked firewood and the snowblower, but the temperature reading for the garage had spiked from 38°F to 78°F in less than a second, then immediately dropped back down. It was physically impossible for the space to heat up that fast. I checked the wiring, the sensor, everything. Nothing was wrong. This was the start of the ghost in the machine. The cameras began to register things that my eyes didn't. The camera, overlooking the small forest clearing behind my cabin, captured a sequence of images that showed the ambient light level dropping to near zero and then returning, all while the sun was high in the sky. The footage was fine. It was the metadata that was wrong, suggesting a localized, unnatural eclipse. This subtle, unexplainable disruption of the data eventually gave way to a direct, terrifying communication through the system's interface. I was in my office one afternoon when the monitoring screen suddenly switched views. I hadn't touched the keyboard or the mouse. The view had cycled from the main 3-camera split to the singular full-screen feed of the porch camera. As I watched, confused, a small, dark object appeared on the front porch. It looked like a handful of wet dirt or mulch. Then, slowly, unnervingly, the object began to move. It dragged itself across the wooden deck, toward the camera lens, leaving a glistening, dark trail. As it neared the lens, it suddenly formed a shape, the faint, rough outline of a single, closed human fist, pressed against the porch wood. The truly horrifying part wasn't the fist, it was the zoom function. My custom interface uses a hotkey to snap the camera to a predetermined focus point. As the fist pressed against the wood, the camera instantly executed a 5x digital zoom, perfectly framing the fist in the center of the screen. I was the only person who knew that hotkey sequence. The entity on the porch had somehow gained access to my local system and used a control function to emphasize its presence. Before I could process the violation, the camera view cycled again, this time to the back clearing, then the garage, then back to the main split screen, as if someone had rapidly toggled through the views, ending exactly where they started, a demonstration of control. I spent the next 3 days reviewing the network logs, the firewall, everything. There was no outside connection, no virus, no logical point of entry. It was like the thing was operating the system from within the cabin, using my own isolated network as its consciousness. The climax of this technological haunting happened late Friday night. I was huddled in the living room, the monitors dark, refusing to look at the feeds. I had unplugged all the screens, but I hadn't shut down the hub. Then I heard it, a soft, distinctive beep coming from the office. It was the sound the security hub makes when the system is receiving a command to remotely arm the perimeter. I froze. I was inside, and the system was already armed. Then the beep started again, forming a simple, erratic rhythm beep. Beep, beep, beep. It wasn't the sound of an alarm. It was the sound of someone hitting the command button repeatedly. Heart hammering, I crept into the office. The monitors were black, but the hub itself was glowing, its small status light flashing the pattern of the remote arm commands. I watched the light pulse, beep, 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 beep. The system wasn't responding to an outside signal. It was processing an internal instruction loop. I reached for the power cord, but before I could yank it, the rhythmic beeping stopped. A single, distinct, final beep sounded, followed by a new, synthesized voice from the hub's tiny internal speaker of voice. I had recorded months ago for system updates. User logged out. The hub status light went dark. When I tried to access the system the next day, it was locked. My own code, my own password, rejected. I had been ejected from my own surveillance system. I live in that cabin still, but I never reinstalled a single camera. The system hub remains in the corner of the office, unplugged, silent, and covered by a blanket. I know it's just dormant. I don't look at it, but I listen to the silence. And sometimes, when the cabin is quiet and the wind outside is still, I hear a faint, high-pitched, metallic click. It's the sound of a relay switch closing inside the blanket-covered box. An acknowledgement that the system is ready, and it is waiting for me to try and log back in.